Hello my friend and fellow trader, welcome back to another lesson. In this lesson I'm going to be showing you how to use tables in your scripts. Now before we start this lesson I should probably show you a valuable use case for tables to get you excited about them and give you an idea of what they're useful for. So let me unhide this script up here, which is a script I'm working on, a strategy script for trading inside bar breakouts at a certain time of day. If I unhide this script, we now have a table drawing onto our chart. And what this table is displaying is how many trades this script took, what my starting capital was, what the total return was over this many trades taken, what my percentage return was, what my max drawdown was, what my pip return was, what my ending account balance was, and what my win rate percentage was, how many trades won versus how many lost. All of this information is displayed onto my chart using a table. And in today's lesson, I'm not going to show you how to create a complex table like this. We'll cover that in future lessons when we get to more practical use cases of the information I'm teaching you here in this basics section. But this is a great example of how you can use a table to display information in a convenient and easy to interpret manner. So let's get into the lesson. So what you see before you right now is a blank script. All I've done is change overlay to true, and we're plotting NA instead of the closing price. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do when working with tables is prepare a table ID. So this is the same thing we do with lines and labels. We need to create a variable and assign it to the table.new function, which generates a new table object that we can manipulate. So here I'm going to comment this and say prepare a table. And I will call this table my table. Now the main difference with tables compared to lines and labels is that we only have one. So if you're working with lines, you could have multiple lines drawing all over your chart. If you're dealing with labels, you can have labels drawing on every bar on your chart or whenever you detect a setup or whatever. With a table, it is a single object that displays somewhere on your chart. So it can be in the top right, bottom right, it can be on the left side, and it can be in the center as well. So there are a bunch of different places we can put this table. I'll show you how to relocate the table later in the lesson. But for now, it's just important for me to mention and for you to understand that tables are a single instance. They're a single object, and we update that object with whatever information we want to display. What that means is the best practice for declaring a table ID is to use the VAR operator or keyword. So the VAR is the keyword used for assigning and one-time initializing a variable, which is to say this variable, whatever we create here, this variable that we create, let's call it X for now, X will be created on the very first bar on our chart. So if I go back to the first historical bar on my chart, which is this bar right here, the last available bar, this variable will be created on this bar, and then it will not update on every new bar that prints onto the chart unless we tell it to be updated. So if we don't use the VAR variable and we said X equals 0, for example, and then later on in our script we changed X to say 7 or 87. It's hard for me to type accurately with a big fat microphone in front of my face, but let's say we want to override X from 0 to 87. What this would do is every single bar on our chart would have the value of X equals 87. However, if we said VAR X equals 0, and then we said if the current bar is the last bar on our chart, and let me tab that in, and then let's plot X to our chart really quickly, save the script. Now when I hover my mouse over any of these historical bars, keep an eye on this number up here. On the very first bar on our chart, it's 0, and all through historical price action, it's 0. But when we get to the very last bar on our chart, it changes to 87. So the VAR variable is persistent across all of our bars until we override it. That is what we want when dealing with tables. So my table here, I'm going to call my table my table. Let's get real creative in this lesson. I like to try and keep these lessons as simple as possible, especially these early lessons, so that there's not too much information to juggle in your head, especially if you're new to this stuff. Let's keep it simple. My table is our variable name. Now we also need to define this variable as a table. So before we name it my table, I need to add in the table keyword here. So now we are creating a persistent VAR variable, which is a table object called myTable. And to create our table, we use the table namespace or library. So to access that library, the inbuilt library, just type out table.control space or command space on a Mac. Here are all of our inbuilt table functions that we have to work with. The function that we want to work with right now is the creation function, which is table.new, this function here. And you can see that it takes a bunch of parameters, which we'll break down in this lesson. So let me click on this function here, open up some parentheses. Let's get started creating our table. So the first parameter this function takes is the position of the table. As I mentioned at the start of the lesson, we can put this anywhere we want, almost anywhere we want. The way we relocate it is using the position dot control space will give us the position namespace or library. These are the built-in variables we have to set the position of our table. And there are quite a few here. I won't go over all of them because they're pretty self-explanatory. We'll start with top right and then we'll come back to this later. So moving on, the next parameter we have to work with is columns and rows. So think of this like a spreadsheet. Your columns is your columns and your rows is your rows. This is where we specify the maximum amount of columns and rows we want to work with in our table. So for today's lesson, I will just set this to 2 columns and 2 rows. This means we'll have 4 cells to work with: the top left, the top right, the bottom left, the bottom right. You can obviously set this number to anything you want. I'm sure there's probably a limit. I'm not sure what the limit is though. Let's have a quick look. So there doesn't appear to be a limit to how many cells you can create, but I'm sure there is certainly a limit in how many you can display onto your chart depending on your screen resolution. But anyway, let's start with 4 cells, 2 columns, 2 rows. And then we have a bunch of other parameters here that we can work with. We'll come back to these later in the lesson once we've built our table. But for now, let's set our border width, the final parameter you see there. Let's set that to 1 pixel. And now if I save my script, this should compile without any errors. Fingers crossed. There we go. No issues. Let me get rid of this script as well. Free up some more chart space. So we've created our table, but as you can see here, it is not anywhere. To display our table, we need to populate it with data. So let's use that function now. Let me create some white space here. The best practice for populating your table data is to do it on the very last bar on your chart. The reason for that is the data, if you update it on historical data, it will never display, because once your script gets to the current bar, the last bar on your chart, whatever your script populates the table with will be what you see. So in other words, you cannot hover your mouse over historical price data and have your table update its display data. That's not how tables work. Tables will only display the last data you populated it with. That means the best practice for drawing tables onto our chart is to only do them on the final bar of your chart. That will make your script a little bit more efficient in terms of its runtime execution. So if you're not updating the table on all these historical bars, these thousands of historical bars, which we can't see anyway, then your script will run just a little bit faster. You probably won't even notice the difference, but it's still a good practice to do this, since having it update on any bar other than the last bar is pointless. So to do that, we just check if bar state is last, then we want to draw our table or populate our table data. Now to do that, as I said, we use the table.control space cell function. So if I click on this cell function here and open up some parentheses, here are all of the parameters we have to work with. So just like using the label and line inbuilt libraries, we need to pass in a ID, a table ID. That is just the variable name of your table. So in this case, we pass in my table, comma, and then we need to specify the column we want to update. Remember, in programming, in coding, everything starts from 0. So to update the first column, we would put 0 in here, and to update the second column, we put another 0 in here. Now the next parameter we have to work with is the text of this cell. So for today, we'll keep it really simple. I'm going to set my text to the current price plus str.toString, the closing price of the current bar. So this will display price and then the number of the price of the current bar converted into a string. So whenever we add numbers to text, we need to use the str, which is short for the string library or namespace, the inbuilt library, and then .toString will convert this number into text. Now notice that I've specified the parameter here. I've mentioned this in previous lessons, but if you haven't seen those lessons, I'll reiterate what's going on here. If you enter each of these parameters in order with the right data types, you do not need to specify this parameter name. But since we're covering this function for the first time, I'll leave the table ID and row and column as they are. But from now on, we will specify what parameter we're dealing with, just to make it clearer how this function works. So there we have our first table data being populated. If I save my script, we will now have a table drawing in the top right of our chart. But as you can see, it's pretty hard to read because we haven't set a background color or text color yet. So let's do that now. You can set the background color of the entire table. So for example, up here, if I put in a comma here and say bg color equals color.white, oops, and save my script, this table now has a white background by default. But you can also override this in your cell function. So here I could say bg color equals color.black, and now the table cell will be a black background. So what that means is you could have a default background for your table, and you could override that if you want to with a different color. So you could have multiple colors across multiple cells. For example, in the script I showed you at the beginning of this lesson, our percentage return had a green background and our max drawdown had a red background. To achieve that, I used the background color function parameter in the cell function. It doesn't really matter how you do this. For now, I'm going to override the main table default background color to color.black. And I'm going to get rid of this since that's now redundant, since we're already setting the background color, the default color of our cells in this table.new function. I don't need to specify that in my cell function unless I want to override this black color with something else. But now, if I leave it like this, our text is still black as well, and we can't read it. So let's change our text color of this cell. For that, I just need to specify the text underscore color parameter, and we can set this to color.white. Now when I save the script, we'll be having white text drawing over a black background in that cell. Now to be able to see some of these other parameters, we need to have more data in our table. So let's copy this line of code, paste it in 3 more times. Now let's change what all of these say. Let's change all of this to just say open, high, low, and close. And we'll change all of these as well, open, high, low, and close. Now this is just for example purposes. Obviously you could change this information to anything you want, indicator values, metrics about your script, your strategy performance, trade setup information, market conditions, all kinds of things. But we'll keep it simple for today. We'll cover more advanced use cases for tables later in the course, once you are more familiar with Python script in general. But if I save this script right now, we're going to have a bit of a mess because all of our text is drawing over the top of each other. The reason this is happening is because we haven't changed our columns and rows here. So to draw this information in a more tidy manner, we need to change our columns and rows so that we don't have them overlapping. So we have our first cell here, 0, 0. The next cell would be 0, 1. And then on these next 2 cells, we need to set our column to 1 on both of these, and then the row from 0 to 1 as well. So this is our first column, our first row, and our second row. Then we have our second column, our first row, and our second row. So now when I save the script, all of our data will be split up properly. There we go. Now notice that the table does not have a gap between the cells. That's because we are using this default background color in the myTable table.new function. If you want a small gap between these cells, we need to cut this parameter and paste it into our individual cells. Now when I save the script, we will get a small gap between each cell. Now this gap is just a transparent gap with no color. So if I put my mouse over the table, you can see the candlesticks showing through the gap. If you don't want that and you want to color the lines between the cells, you can use the background color function on your table and also set the border color to anything. Let's set it to color.red. Save our code. Now we have a red line between all of our cells. There are a few other parameters we can play around with. For example, we have frame color and frame width. Let's try setting frame color to color.orange. And before we continue, let me move some of this onto a new line. I've shown you how to do this in other lessons, but if you haven't seen those, all you do is press enter, tab, and then space, and then this function will now compile even though it's split up over multiple lines. Let's change the frame width to, let's just leave it at 1 for now and save the script, see what happens. So now we have a frame around our table with an orange color. Let's change frame width to 10, see what that looks like. So now we have a very thick frame width around our table. And that is all of our table parameters when creating a new table that we can play with. The only one we haven't adjusted really yet is border width. Let's set that to 10 and see what that looks like. So now the inside border is much thicker between our cells. The final thing I want to show you before we wrap up this lesson is some of the other table functions we have. So within this bar state.isLast statement, so everything that's been tabbed in here belongs to this if statement and will only be executed if this is true. We will cover if statements and other operators in PineScript in the next section. So don't worry if this is confusing to you. Just focus on the table.cell functions for now. I can add another check in here. I can say if the current bar is bearish, so its close is currently lower than its open, then we can set table.control space, and here are all of our set functions. I won't go over all of these because they all behave identically. Once you understand how one works, you understand how they all work. But basically, we can set or override information on our table using these functions here. So for example, on a bearish bar, let's change the background color of our chart to red. So let's use this function here, set bg color. This function takes a table ID, so we need to pass in my table or whatever you call your table. And then we need to pass in a color. So here I can say color.red. Now when I save this script, the background color of our table should turn red because the current bar is bearish. Let's change it to green if the current bar is bullish. So if the current closes higher than its open, set bg color of my table to color.green. We'll save that and we'll drop out to let's try a daily chart. There we go. So the current bar is currently bullish, at least it's closing higher than it's open, and our background has changed to green. Now there are obviously a whole bunch of other things here. We can set the height of our table, we can set the text, we can clear all of the data in our table, and we can even move the position of our table. So let me show you some of the positions we have to work with. Let me get rid of this code for now, and we'll just keep a simple plain table. We don't want it looking too funky and distracting. Let's overwrite top right with one of these other options. I'll just show you a couple because they all are pretty self-explanatory. Middle center, let's see what that looks like. Now that's directly in the center of our chart. And let's try bottom left. Save the code. Now it's down here. You can set it wherever you want. There's a lot of options here to choose from. I'll leave it as top right for now. Save the script. And before we wrap up this lesson, let's just have a look at some of these other cell parameters we have to work with. So we've covered everything up to text and some of the color parameters. Let's look at width, height, and some of the align values and text size. So let's try width. Let's see what happens when we set width on this cell to 10. Save the script. Nothing seems to happen there, which is interesting. Let's try it on the cell below it as well. Maybe it's because, and nothing happens there. I'll try a few different values here until we get something. There we go. So 10 was too large. By setting it to a lower number, we have a much smaller cell. So if you don't specify the width, then TradingView will automatically calculate a cell that's big enough to fill your data or fit your data. But if you do specify a width, then you can custom set the width of your cells. But I would recommend in most cases just leaving it automatically calculated, unless you have a special use case for changing the width of your cells. The next parameter we'll have a quick look at is height. Well, height does the same thing as width. Obviously, if we set height to 1, save the code. And now just setting it on one cell won't help because we need to set it across the entire row. So I need to also set the 0 row on the second column to 1 height as well. Otherwise, it gets that whole row gets overwritten with this second row's height. So if you have multiple cells on your chart, you can only change the width and height of the ones that are on the same column or row. So that's width and height. Let's have a look at text align. So we have horizontal align and vertical align, H align and V align. Let's try text H align equals text dot control space. And here are a bunch we have to work with. Let's try left. Save the script. So now you can see this text is aligned to the left where all of the others are centered by default. And if we press control space on this text library, inbuilt namespace or library, we have all of these variables to choose from. So let's try top, see if that works. And now we have an error. It's hard to see, but if I move my chart over a bit, you can see this red exclamation mark here. If I hover over that, it says study error. If I click on it, it says unknown text align value. So for whatever reason, this text align value does not work on tables. Only center, left, and right will work. Bottom won't work either. But for now, we have the typical text align left, right, and center. Let me change that one to right. Now you can see it's shifted a little bit to the right. Let's try on a different cell, text underscore V align. Now this is probably where our top and bottom come into place. So let's try top here. Save the script. There we go. So that is what the text align top and bottom is for. Is for our vertical align, V align. So by default, it's set in the middle or center, I'm guessing. If we use center, I'm guessing that will move that back to the center. There we go, it does. But we do have top and bottom to work with in our cells when it comes to aligning our text. And then finally, we have text size. That's the final parameter we haven't covered yet in the lesson. Let's change the text size of this cell. So text underscore size equals. Now this text size parameter takes a size, inbuilt size variable. So if you type out size dot control space, we have a bunch of sizes to choose from. If I try tiny, let's see how small that text is. There we go. It's not that small, but that's because I'm on a very large screen resolution. I'm sure on a normal resolution, this would be probably a bit smaller. And let's try huge. Save the script. There we go, much bigger there. By default, this is set to auto. So I can get rid of this text size parameter. And now we have normal text size. Let's get rid of these so that our table is nice and centered across the board. And that will do it for today's lesson. I hope you found this interesting. In future lessons, we will cover more practical use cases of tables. But for now, this is what all of the parameters do. This is how we create tables, and this is how we manipulate tables. And with all that said, I will see you in the next lesson. Take care, and I'll speak with you soon.